On January 30th, 1968, the conflict in Vietnam takes a pause for people to celebrate the Tet Nguyen Dian, the festival of the first day, the Vietnamese New Year. The city of Hue, the ancient capital of Vietnamese Emperors, is littered with thousands of lights. Yet the atmosphere in the city is all but festive, as if everyone expects something bad to happen. In the middle of the night, a bright glow lights up the night sky. It's not the usual fireworks, but a signal flare that marks the beginning of an attack. The city of Hue has become a key target of the notorious Tet Offensive and throws South Vietnam into one of the Vietnam War's most ferocious battles. Although the city of Hue was yet another of many Tet Offensive targets, it was certainly one with the greatest symbolic significance. It was the capital of Vietnam under the Nguyen dynasty from 1802 to 1945. It was the center of the Buddhist movement and an intellectual hub for a number of prominent schools and a university. Some of the leading communist leaders were educated in this city, including Ho Chi Minh and General Giap. Hue was divided into two main sections. The old city Citadel on the north bank of the Perfume River housed formal gardens, markets, private residences, pagodas, and the Imperial Palace. Inspired by Beijing's Forbidden City, it was encircled by a 20-foot thick stone walls and a wide water-filled moat. South of the Perfume River lay the newer part of the city. This area, home to Hue University, public buildings and European-style structures, was known as the Triangle due to its irregular shape. The two sections were connected by two key bridges, the Bac Ho Railroad Bridge and the Nguyen Wang Bridge. For a city of great size and significance, Hue was thinly defended on the eve of Tet. The South Vietnamese military presence in the area consisted of fewer than 1,000 active troops. Many soldiers were on leave celebrating Tet with their families either in Hue or nearby districts. The key ARVN force within the city was Brigadier General Trong's 1st Infantry Division, based in Mang Ka Fortress in the Citadel's northeast corner. However, of the entire force, combat units within the Citadel comprised only the 36-man reconnaissance platoon and the elite 240 Hoc Bao Black Panther Company. The rest of the troops were either stationed outside the city or engaged in sweeping missions in the nearby area. The American presence in Hue was minimal, consisting of approximately 200 U.S. servicemen, mainly non-combatants. These personnel were assigned various roles, including the U.S. MACV compound, Armed Forces Radio and Television Service, and the 135th Military Intelligence Group. U.S. government employees, contractors, and missionaries were scattered across the city in hotels, rented homes, and churches. However, less than 7 miles from the city, the Americans held the Phu Bai Combat Base. The base had been recently taken over by the Task Force X-Ray, a brigade-sized component of the 1st Marine Division. The task force was responsible for the entire Thu Thien province, coordinating efforts with the 1st ARVN Division. The nearest U.S. Army unit to Hue was the 3rd Brigade, 1st Cavalry Division, stationed at Camp Evans, 27 kilometers northwest of the city. Unlike their counterparts, the North Vietnamese prepared substantial forces for the attack on the city. The North Vietnamese established the Hue City Front, comprising 11 battalions organized in 2 offensive wings. The northern part of the city was to be attacked by the 800th, 802nd, 806th, and 416th Battalions of the NVA 6th Regiment with the support of the Viet Cong 12th Sapper Battalion. Units engaged south of the Perfume River consisted of the NVA's 4th Regiment's 804th, 815th, and 818th Battalions and 2 VC Sapper Battalions, the 1st and the 2nd. By January 30th, 1968, enemy forces disguised as civilians began infiltrating Hue, mingling with Tet holiday crowds. Some wore ARVN uniforms and waited in pre-designated positions. In the north, the 6th Regiment's troops gathered on Hill 138 for final preparations, eating a meal and listening to speeches about their historic mission. By midnight, they resumed their march toward the Citadel, ready to begin their assault on Hue. That same day, General Trong sensed something bigger was going on. He canceled all leave and placed his troops on high alert. At 10 o'clock p.m., regional forces near An Hoa Bridge reported enemy movements. Shortly before midnight, one of the units outside the Citadel walls spotted a North Vietnamese column advancing toward the city. Despite immediate warnings and a reconnaissance flight, poor visibility obscured the enemy's approach. Mere 2 hours past midnight, a 4-man North Vietnamese sapper team disguised in South Vietnamese Army uniforms approached the western gate of the Citadel. They attacked the guards, killed them, and opened the gate. Using flashlights, they signaled the rest of the troops to advance. In no time, the NVA forces flooded the city. The 800th and 802nd Battalions advanced through the western gate and moved north. Within minutes, they engaged the Black Panthers defending the Tay Loc airfield. Despite being largely outnumbered, the Black Panthers repelled all enemy attacks by dawn. While the battle for the airfield raged, the 802nd Battalion attacked the 1st Division headquarters. Although they breached the compound, a makeshift defense of 200 staff officers, clerks, and support personnel held them off. General Trong recalled most of the Black Panther Company from the airfield to strengthen the headquarters defense. By morning, over 60% of the Citadel, including the Imperial Palace, was under communist control. At 8 o'clock a.m., North Vietnamese forces raised the Viet Cong flag over the Citadel's towering flagpole. On the brink of total defeat, General Trong called for reinforcements to relieve the pressure on his headquarters at Mang Ca. All troops from the area responded to the call, but breaching into the Citadel held by large enemy formations was nowhere near an easy task. Across the Perfume River in Southern Way, U.S. advisors in the U.S. MACV compound awoke to the sounds of mortar and enemy fire. The 4th NVA Regiment launched their attack, targeting key locations throughout the city. However, unlike those up north, their operations lacked coordination. One unit even got lost in the city and failed to reach its objective. Despite these setbacks, the NVA captured most of Southern Way, leaving only the prison, the U.S. MACV compound, and the Way LCU ramp in Allied hands. Almost immediately upon consolidating their positions, Pavan initiated a reign of terror. Armed with lists of government officials, military personnel, and foreigners, they rounded up targets and marched them to a local school. Those who did not surrender were hunted down. These individuals were later found in mass graves, victims of brutal executions. On the morning of January 31st, Brigadier General Foster LeHue, the commander of the Task Force X-Ray, learned that Way City was under attack. He immediately sent Alpha Company 1st Battalion 1st Marines under Captain Gordon D. Batchelor to assist the besieged MACV personnel in Way. As Alpha moved north, they joined 4 M48 Patton tanks. Together, they entered Way only to be met with increasing enemy fire. Under the guidance of Gunnery Sergeant John Canley and Sergeant Alfredo Gonzalez, the Marines overcame enemy strongpoints and reached the MACV compound. There, they set up defensive positions and evacuated the worst wounded by helicopter. Fighting continued into the night. By the morning of February 1st, the situation was clear to South Vietnamese and American troops in Way. They were in dire need of reinforcement if they were not to be overrun by the enemy. In Da Nang, commander of the ARVN 1 Corps Lieutenant General Wang Jian Lam and General Robert E. Cushman Jr., commanding the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, agreed that the 1st ARVN Division would secure the Citadel while Task Force X-Ray cleared the area south of the Perfume River. Operation Way City was set in motion. Already at 0700 on February 1st, the 1st Battalion 1st Marines, supported by tanks, advanced towards Way. Their task was to free the Chua Tian provincial headquarters and prison, but upon entering the city, they found that the enemy's strength far exceeded their initial estimates. As night approached, they prepared for a night assault on the prison, but gave up after learning that all prisoners were free. North of the Perfume River, the 1st ARVN Division achieved a limited success. While the 3rd Regiment's 2nd and 3rd Battalions were unable to breach the Citadel, the 2nd and 7th Airborne Battalions, with armored support in the Black Panther Company, retook Tay Loc Airfield. By 1500, the 1st Battalion 3rd Regiment reached the 1st Division command post. Meanwhile, Marine helicopters from HMM 165 transported part of the 4th Battalion 2nd Regiment into the Citadel under enemy fire. Despite the difficulties in overcoming enemy resistance, General Cushman and General Lamb decided against using heavy artillery or airstrikes to protect Way's historic sites. Instead, they ordered their troops to keep pressing. General Cushman also deployed the 1st Cavalry Division's 3rd Brigade from Camp Evans to support the operation. Unfortunately, it took some time for these troops to enter the fight due to bad weather that reduced the visibility and dropped the cloud ceiling to only 300 feet. The following 7 days, from February 2nd to the 8th, the Marines and ARVN soldiers fought the enemy in fierce house-to-house combat, and every building was a battle of its own. Marines in Southern Way encountered fierce opposition as they attacked 3 enemy strongholds: the Public Health Office, the Treasury, and the Post Office. These buildings had thick concrete walls, making it difficult for the Marines to penetrate them with rifle fire. To overcome them, the Marines had to use creative tactics. They used recoilless rifles, mortars, and explosives to breach enemy defenses. They blasted holes through walls to avoid exposed entrances, enabling safer advances for the soldiers. At the Treasury building, Major Ralph J. Salvati deployed CS gas against the enemy troops holding the building. Wearing gas masks, the Marines entered under the cover of mortar and rocket fire and drove the enemy out. Indeed, the North Vietnamese were a tough nut to crack. They centered their defense on strong points, heavily fortified positions with automatic weapons designed to protect adjacent positions. Inside a building, they built bunkers for automatic weapons on the 1st floor and positioned snipers above. Spider holes manned by soldiers with AK-47s were placed in courtyards. Each building operated as a fortress, limiting Allied movement and casualty retrieval. One Marine described the combat as fighting a hive of bees. The fire was constant from ground level, 2nd floors, and rooftops, making it necessary to crawl and call in tanks to aid in wounded retrieval. To make things worse, the maps available to the Marines were inadequate, showing little detail. Men on the ground had to create makeshift solutions like local street maps until detailed military maps arrived. Larger compounds such as the city hospital and the provincial headquarters proved to be particularly difficult to conquer. At the hospital compound, the Marines spent 2 days clearing it. If it wasn't for tanks and recoil rifles, they would have hardly defeated the enemy in the main hospital building. One building, however, was so vigorously defended by the enemy that the Marines ultimately had to call for artillery support. The enemy gave up only after 40 high explosive shells from 105mm howitzers dropped on their positions. A similar situation was at the provincial headquarters. The Marines attacked it with tanks, mortars, and gas, enduring hours of heavy fighting. They eventually captured the building and raised the American flag over it. Filmed by a CBS crew, the moment became a symbol for the victory and way. On February 7th, the NVA began retreating from Southern Way. This part of the city was secured, but at a heavy cost. The Marines suffered 38 deaths and over 320 wounded. The North Vietnamese losses were even greater, with over 1,000 killed. Despite the Marines' success in Southern Way, the battle for the Citadel in the northern part of the city loomed ahead. The ARVN forces attacking the Citadel did it with steady progress. They first cleared parts of the northwest corner where the division headquarters was. From there, they pushed toward the Imperial Palace, facing growing resistance from the enemy who used buildings of thick stone and masonry as defensive positions. By February 4th, ARVN forces killed nearly 700 NVA troops but made little advance, especially because the North Vietnamese kept bringing in new troops. On February 7th, General Trong moved 3 more battalions of the 3rd Regiment into the Citadel. ARVN and NVA forces fought street by street, but the North Vietnamese retained control over 60% of the Citadel. It was only when the U.S. forces joined the fight that things started to change. The 1st Cavalry Division troops advanced from the northwest but were attacked by NVA forces at the village of K Chu. They avoided being encircled by passing the enemy position once the night fell. From the east, the 5th Marines entered the Citadel and established their position within the Old City. Fighting alongside ARVN soldiers, they pressed against the entrenched enemy. With limited artillery support and poor weather, they made slow progress. The NVA's ability to reinforce their troops at night further prolonged the stalemate. In the close quarters of the Citadel, fighting became an intense struggle. With little room to maneuver, the Marines had to engage in brutal close combat to advance even short distances. The fiercest resistance enemies showed in defending the flag tower. Pressed by their commanders and political commissars, the North Vietnamese were prepared to fight to the very end to defend the VC banner flying over their heads. On 15 February, after days of heavy bombardment, the Marines launched yet another attack on the tower. Tanks, Ontos vehicles, and air support combined with infantry assaults to push the attack forward. Under heavy cover from artillery and aircraft, Delta Company, led by Captain Myron Harrington, crept across the wall and toward the tower. They cleared the enemy foxholes with hand grenades and rifle fire and ultimately managed to secure a foothold at the tower. However, the North Vietnamese were still defending the tower fiercely, forcing the Marines into 6 more hours of grueling fighting. At one moment, Private First Class Johnny Holliday stood up, took his machine gun, and charged alone against the enemy position, firing the gun from his hip. His action inspired the rest of the company to follow and eventually capture the tower. The charge cost the Marines 6 men killed and over 50 wounded. That night, the North Vietnamese launched a surprise counterattack, briefly retaking the tower. Captain Harrington led a counteroffensive, reclaiming the position. Fighting continued into the night as the Marines held their ground against determined NVA assaults. The North Vietnamese had lost a symbol of their victory in Hue and were in a dire situation of losing the battle. Their commander was killed during an attack by fire, troops were steadily losing their ground, and the losses were heavy. The new commander recommended a withdrawal from the Citadel. His request was denied, and he was ordered to continue fighting. On February 17th, reinforcements from the 101st Airborne Division of the 1st Air Cavalry Division joined the battle. After securing the palace and the tower, the U.S. and ARVN forces shifted their focus toward the Citadel's southwestern wall. There, the enemy turned the ruins into small fortresses of resistance. It took another week until the last North Vietnamese strongpoint in the Citadel was eliminated. On February 24th, ARVN soldiers raised the South Vietnamese flag over the Citadel. After 25 days of bitter fighting, the enemy was finally pushed out of the old city. The Marines, however, continued their operations for another week. With all key points in the city secured, the focus was given to relieving the encircled American and South Vietnamese units and pushing the enemy away from the area. Operation Hue City officially ended on March 2, 1968. The battle for Hue claimed heavy losses on all sides. Among the Allied forces, the Americans lost 216 men with another 1,548 wounded. The South Vietnamese reported 452 killed and 2,123 wounded. With no official records, estimates claimed that over 5,000 communists, whose total forces during the fighting within the city had risen to roughly 12,000 men, had been killed inside the city and another 3,000 killed in battles in the surrounding areas. Much of the once beautiful city lay in ruins. 40% of the city was completely destroyed and estimated 80% damaged. The civilian toll was the most devastating. Thousands of people lost their lives and entire families torn apart. Over 5,800 civilians were dead or missing and 116,000 left homeless. The city itself was devastated, with refugee camps being constructed across the area. Families fled the city, seeking shelter in nearby villages or makeshift camps. Aid workers struggled to provide food, water, and medical care. Thousands found temporary refuge in places like Hue University and local churches. Efforts to bury the dead and rebuild basic services were slow and painful. As for the broader Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese admitted they suffered a terrible defeat. More communist soldiers died in 1968 than did American soldiers during 10 years of involvement. Of the 84,000 troops committed to Tet, nearly 58,000 had been killed. The communist strategy of bringing local VC cadres into the streets resulted in an unmitigated disaster. Instead of sparking a countrywide insurrection, it ended up a bloodbath, virtually destroying the Viet Cong infrastructure in the South and eliminating the VC as an effective fighting force. Despite the overwhelming tactical victory achieved by the Allied forces in Hue and other battlefields throughout South Vietnam, the Tet Offensive proved a strategic defeat for the United States in the end. Ironically, the overwhelming victory achieved by the Allies in the Tet Offensive marked the beginning of the end for American presence in Vietnam due to the negative media attention and resulting pressure on the Johnson administration to end the conflict. The Battle of Hue was by far the most devastating urban battle of the Vietnam War. Hue City has been rebuilt since the battle. However, there are still reminders of the fight that occurred there for generations to come. In some of the buildings today, there are pockmarks in some of the building exteriors that were hit with machine gun fire. These scars of war remain etched not only on the physical landscape, but also on the hearts and souls of those who survived. Thank you for watching this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified of our next video. Stay tuned.